It's a common trope in media to see giant walls defending the edges of the known world against the horrors which lie beyond. Whether this be historical fortifications like the Great Wall of China and Hadrian's Wall of northern Britain, or perhaps even their fantasy derivatives like the Great Bastion of Warhammer Fantasy or the Wall in Game of Thrones. All of these depictions have common themes. This fortification marks the end of the civilized world. Beyond lies a dangerous, mysterious realm into which no one ventures. The wall is a single-layered piece of military infrastructure. This bastion primarily serves as a defense against invasions. And ultimately, massive armies will crash upon the walls in a huge climactic battle for the fate of civilization. However, upon closer examination of the historical record, we find that most of these points are greatly misleading with regards to how actual frontier fortifications functioned in the past. For context, we can hit on a couple of these points briefly right now. First, civilizations extended to both sides of frontiers, with a great degree of mixing at all levels of society between the two. Second, borders rarely acted as the end of an empire's sphere of influence, and active measures were taken to ensure its reach stretched well beyond this line on a map. Third, frontier defenses were multi-layered at both the macro and the micro levels. Fourth, walls served many roles, most commonly as a means to control the flow of goods, people, and information. In military matters, they primarily acted as tripwires and early warning signs against endemic raiding, rather than bulwarks against invasion. And fifth, massed assaults were extremely rare, with frontiers usually being bypassed or infiltrated. If these sorts of mass assaults did occur, the defender's resource allocation dilemma and the attacker's control of the time and place of battle usually led to a lopsided fight at the weakest point of the line. As a further counterpoint, frontier defenses were actually more often used as staging points for invasions in the opposite direction, rather than being on the receiving end of them. So as you can see, the Hollywood depictions we're used to can actually be deeply misleading. Unfortunately, this misconception has bled over, not just into historical media, but also works of fiction, where Great Wall analogs are everywhere. So whether you want to better understand history or engage in more realistic world building, this video is meant for you. So now, in this episode, let's get started by diving into the fascinating details of each of our major misconceptions and correcting them with facts. This is how ancient frontier defenses actually worked. Now, as you can imagine, the existence of the frontier carved a huge divide between the land and its people. But at the same time, it opened up a new opportunity for people on both sides to redefine themselves. Whether legionary or tribesman, newfound wealth and social mobility was theirs to be had. Now, back in those days, social mobility was extremely limited. But nowadays, if you're tired of your current occupation, burned down, want to earn more, and want to bring a fresh start to your life, you can do it in less than a year. So let's start a path to wealth and a brighter future with a few small steps right now. Today's sponsor, Triple 10, can help you make a career pivot into tech. Nowadays, technology is one of the most in-demand industries. Good specialists are always needed, and more different startups appear every day. Triple 10 is a bootcamp for online education which offers beginner-friendly programs in a variety of fields, from software engineering to business intelligence analytics. So as an example, let's take a look here at their 8-month curriculum for a data science program. It has 3 core modules, each composed of multiple 1 to 2 week sprints on specific themes. The learning process is meant to be flexible, with self-paced practice available on the Triple 10 interactive platform, live feedback from tech professionals, and help from success managers. The program culminates in an employment preparation module where you'll take on real-world projects, build your portfolio, practice interviews, and optimize your job search. A nice perk of the program is that graduating comes with a 10-month job guarantee or your money back. So get a Triple 10 career consultation today for free and get started on one of their programs using my link in the description and the code Invicta for 30% off. And of course, do your due diligence to make sure you're an informed consumer. Best of luck. Returning to our list of major tropes, let's now take a closer look at the realities of each one of these in turn. If there's a topic that interests you, be sure to use the timestamps below to jump ahead. Otherwise, let's get started. Walls manifesting as the edge of civilization is probably the most common trope. You often hear this explicitly stated in films like The Eagle, which shows guards on Hadrian's wall saying, "Didn't they tell you this is the end of the world?" Though admittedly this example can be forgiven in the context of troops using hyperbole and dark humor. But the error in the statement still stands. In Game of Thrones though, this idea is pushed to its literal extremes, where the wall was actually built as a bastion at the end of the world to keep the apocalyptic threat of the White Walkers from overrunning Westeros. It's easy to see why this idea has proven so powerful as a literary tool. It's big, it's mysterious, and it's a physical embodiment of timeless themes of the known and the unknown, the civilized and the barbaric. As a result, great walls, or other colossal barriers, pop up in many, many fantasy works. It's gotten to the point that I bet most people's first attempt at world building features some form of Great Wall analog. And why not? They're awesome. At least in theory. So we might ask, to what extent were the edges of civilization actually defined by these great walls? Well, the first thing to admit is that defenses around civilization certainly did exist. Virtually everyone throughout history has sought to find a way to demarcate and protect what is theirs. Most often, however, this has come in some form of geographic barrier, like a river or a mountain range. But none of these are completely impassable, and usually there is some attempt to reinforce nature's walls. Celtic peoples, for instance, were known to cultivate organic hedges of thick bramble and thorns as barriers. The ancient Germanic tribes, meanwhile, were reported to maintain large stretches of depopulated zones around their territory as a warning sign to outsiders. Inevitably in history, though, we find that once communities can afford it, they start to invest in more robust defensive infrastructure. But this sort of thing is usually quite expensive, so projects often start small. Hill forts are a common pattern we see replicated across the world, from the oppidums of Gaul to the acropolises of Greece, wherein a community establishes a strong point within which it can shelter in times of danger. Eventually, though, the peoples of wealthy, populated urban centers find it inconvenient to abandon and potentially lose their homes every time an enemy strikes at them. Therefore, they often upgrade their defenses to a circuit wall which encompasses the entirety of the city. But populations expand, and in time they will spill out past their own walls. Usually what you get in this case is a series of new walls being built to encompass the latest expansions. Rome and Jerusalem, for instance, are famous for having multiple such growth rings. At a certain point, though, only the most powerful cities or capitals can afford to keep up with urban sprawl. The Rajasthan region of India is one such example that features strong rulers who built numerous walled complexes that run over 10 to 20 kilometers in perimeter. In antiquity, though, Carthage boasted among the largest circuit wall structures. It is reported to have run 33 kilometers long, encompassing not just the city and its docks, but also an entire agricultural district. Beyond this upper limit, it becomes impractical to build a set of walls capable of encircling anything more than a city or tiny kingdom. Fully walled-off civilizations just weren't a thing. The best you could hope for was the strategic reinforcement of key regions. Given enough money, resources, and time, like the dynasties of China, the results could nonetheless be incredible. Here we see early states of the 5th century BC constructing long walls in the heartland to separate each other, whilst by the 3rd century BC, these efforts are turned against their nomadic neighbors. From then on, centuries of dynastic construction would eventually yield the Great Wall complex, which, when you add up all the small, non-contiguous sections, runs for hundreds of kilometers. But even this was not a silver bullet strategy. For large states and gargantuan empires, other defensive solutions were needed. At this level, the lines we draw on maps are more like guidelines. In reality, the borders of ancient empires were very fuzzy and seldom anchored on a singular set of walls or geographic barriers, as might be seen in historical media. Certainly, static defenses still played a role, as we see with the empires of Rome, the Sassanids, and the various Chinese dynasties. But these were more about finding ways to stretch the efficacy of limited manpower and control key choke points, rather than completely sealing off empires with an impregnable bastion. Even if you could complete the seal, this would be a fool's errand. After all, the dispersed, static nature of such a defensive strategy would always prove vulnerable to the mobile, concentrated efforts of a determined foe who could easily poke a hole at the time and place of their choosing. Therefore, what you get instead is a different model of defending civilization. One based on a more fluid sphere of influence, which serves as the primary defense of the empire. Let's now discuss this point. When talking about spheres of influence, we should recognize that it's a broad term, which can encompass any number of means by which a group might influence an area beyond their home region. In the past, just as today, this includes things like language, culture, commerce, and diplomacy. However, in the Bronze and Iron Ages, relations between neighbors were more often than not dictated through force. After all, the most common form of warfare in this era was small-scale raiding. Typically, conflicts hovered around this low level, only occasionally escalating along a scale of violence. Flare-ups usually resulted from a real or perceived imbalance in power. For instance, let's say a few individuals rustle cattle or steal some goods from their neighbor. They make it home safe. Next year, they decide to try again, this time with a few more friends. If this goes well, then the natural response is to just keep taking while the taking is good. Soon, word gets out, and a dozen men becomes 100 men, which becomes 1,000 men. This is how many raider societies operated, from the Vikings to the Mongols. Even so-called civilized peoples operated in a similar manner, with just a veneer of formality over the top. After all, the loot and prestige to be gained in such affairs is what fueled much of ancient society, and so there was always an incentive to keep going. At least until something changed the risk-to-reward ratio. This is how geopolitical pecking orders were usually established. The strong took what they could, while the weak suffered what they must. Large civilizations were no different, and had to make sure that they projected strength to maintain their sphere of influence and dissuade attacks. For most of Rome's history, this is how it defended its borders, through the use of field armies whose approach to a good defense was a good offense. Even when they did ultimately form defensive frontiers, it was always best practice to remind those on the other side that Rome was powerful. Maintaining patrols, intercepting raids, and launching punitive campaigns were vital to maintaining security. Failure to do so could prove disastrous, and we have numerous instances where the redeployment of legions to fight wars to the east precipitated enemies in the west to attack them, and vice versa. We see the same thing happening across all major empires, whose most effective border policies always involve proactive measures beyond the walls. At the end of the day, projecting strength, even if it was just a facade, was key to preventing an attack in the first place. But I wanted to conclude this section with a reminder that it wasn't all just military bluster. Non-military spheres of influence were also vital to maintaining good relations across borders and fostering a network of allies who could come to your aid. Along Rome's frontiers, for instance, we know that there was a great degree of mixing with the locals. People got married, languages melded, religions syncretized, and cultures cross-pollinated in a myriad of ways. Even in an official capacity, Roman officers were encouraged to enmesh themselves in the human environment, attending tribal meetings, hosting delegations, and otherwise acting as a reliable partner. Once all this had been done, the empire could pursue its ideal outcome, using its frontier as a means to control trade and commerce, thus extracting massive amounts of resources in times of peace, rather than bleeding resources away in times of war. A similar dynamic is at play in the border regions of other empires. The Great Wall in China, for instance, was an excellent means of redirecting trade caravans and monopolizing access to the Silk Road to the benefit of the dynasties. Thus do we also see that the idea of an ancient border standing as some stark divide between a civilized and uncivilized world is also a myth. Everything was interconnected, and gradients existed in both directions. With this in mind, let's now move on to our next topic of examining the nature of fortified borders when they did indeed occur. As discussed previously, these could take many shapes and sizes, but were usually contoured to take advantage of pre-existing geographic realities. The Romans and Sassanids, for instance, had very different border regions to contend with, and each one adopted a unique method to secure them against their opposition. Yet even then, policy was not uniform. In the conquest of northern Britain, for instance, we see the legions begin by building a series of forts in the foothills of modern Scotland. However, after reconsidering their appetite for occupation, they fall back to build Hadrian's Wall. After this, though, within a few decades they go back north to build the Antonine Wall, only to once more return back to Hadrian's Wall, before eventually being evacuated from Britannia completely. The Germanic frontier saw similar evolutions in terms of the layout of its infrastructure and the nature of its construction. Most media depictions would have you believe that these sorts of border facilities were singular in nature, consisting of a long, unbroken wall. Yet when we look at the Rhine and Danube frontiers of the Roman era, and even the Great Wall network of China, what we see at a macro level is a similar multi-layered porous system. In this case, the hub of the defenses are the major castles. Radiating out from them are a network of roads which link forts, watchtowers, and walls. The idea here is that even Rome and China could suffer from limited manpower. By adopting this defense-in-depth approach, they could more efficiently spread troops to cover more ground. In small groups, these could then efficiently act as the eyes and ears of the army, circulating information up the chain of command, whose leadership would in turn be responsible for pooling resources to dynamically respond to threats as they arose. Even in places like Hadrian's Wall, where the macro view does indeed appear to depict a linear defensive line, we've but to zoom in a bit more to see nuances. Jutting out from the wall are a number of exterior positions, whilst in the interior lie additional facilities for housing troops and material. These in turn are connected to arterial roads that lead back to the major legionary bases, whose locations hold a more strategically sound position in central Britain. Suffice to say, no border wall was truly effective without these broader support systems in place. Even if we ignored all this, the micro level of the frontier defenses are anything but singular stretches of earth, wood, and stone. Cutting a section through Hadrian's Wall, for instance, we see that in front of the position is a large ditch inlaid with traps. Behind it stands the wall, which itself is studded by gatehouses, towers, and fortlets. Running to the rear is a military road, followed by a series of additional mounds and ditches. This vallum is believed to have acted as a security feature which demarcated the start of the military zone, beyond which no civilians could interfere. The world's other long wall fortifications exhibit similar levels of nuance. Places like the Great Wall of Gorgon in northern Iran, for instance, once boasted numerous defensive layers and supporting infrastructure. Unfortunately, the example of many of these historical structures have all too often been overlooked in favor of the dumbed-down wall design we see in media. Now that we have better explained the broader context around frontier walls and their layouts, we can discuss how they actually functioned as military defenses. As previously discussed, most warfare of the past consisted of low-level raiding, which a proactive defense policy would keep in check to avoid an escalation of violence. To this end, walls acted primarily as a tripwire and warning system for such small raids, rather than as bulwarks against major invasions. I recently had the pleasure of speaking to Roman historian Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy about this topic, and wanted to share his insights with you now.
So, attacking the Roman Empire, it's a little bit like launching an air raid. You know you're going to want to end up back at home landing at your base. You know that it'll be hard for them to meet you coming in. So, because even with radar and things like that, yes, it will report them, but they're still moving very quickly. And then that report's got to go to someone, and you've got to scramble aircraft to intercept. They've got to physically travel that distance to do that. In the ancient world, everything's far slower. You can send basic signals with smoke, light a beacon, something like that. You can use flags, maybe some others, but those are basic messages, sort of basically alarm a problem, something to look out for, therefore send out some proper patrols to go and see what's going on. Everything else has to be written down and then physically carried or carried in the man's head and reported that way. And it is interesting. There has been some good work done on Hadrian's Wall that the mile castles that we thought of originally, this is just very bureaucratic, every mile they build one of these things. Actually, they shift position by up to a couple of 100 yards from where they should be, so that they're in the best position to be seen by the largest garrison nearby. So they could be seen, they're not in contact with each other, because if you've got 20 odd men at a mile castle, there isn't that much point in raising the alarm with the 20 more men who are over to the east or over to the west. But there is a real benefit from going back to the garrison of 500 or 1,000 men that's a few miles away and saying to them, look, we're in trouble. There's some bad guys about. You need to do something about this. And that's clearly how it's all structured. You can see the same pattern on other Roman frontiers as well. Between an outpost and a major fort, then they build a relay station, another tower on top of the hill, so it can basically pass the message along. Again, it just has to be a simple alarm, but it's something to get you going. Means that in the main garrison, you can start saying, okay, let's get 50 men, 60 men, whatever it might be, ready to move in 1 hour's notice or 2 hours notice, ready with field equipment, horses ready, because obviously a cavalry are the people most suited to chasing any raiders. So it's, again, makes sense in the film. You've got the Sarmatians riding up to save the day, but again, comes back to this fact that we've got 25% of the soldiers stationed in and around Hadrian's Wall are cavalrymen, because they need to be able to get to the problem quickly, but they're also the best people to go out looking for it as well, to recce, report what they see, and then ride back with the messages to say, look, there's trouble, we need to do something about this. So horsemen are really important, and there's a little bit of evidence from some of the horse trappings and things found like that, that even a mile castle may have had 1 or 2 horses in it, at least some of the time, which again would make sense. You don't need a force of cavalrymen, but you need somebody who can get on a horse and then gallop as fast as they can with a detailed report to the area where you've got a concentration of troops that can start to gather people together to deal with it.
This air raid model is a great way to think about ancient border theory. Yet we should be careful to note that Dr. Goldsworthy is talking about the function of Roman walls in antiquity. While many ideas carry over to other borders, there will be some differences in function when you shift drastically in region and time period. But a deeper dive into that topic will have to wait for another time. For now, let's conclude with the final trope about these border fortifications, that their biggest threat was a climactic battle for the walls. As we previously stated, grand invasions were quite rare. If the walls were doing their thing of maintaining economic stability and deterring small raids, then matters would most likely not have a chance of escalating. A destabilized border, on the other hand, was usually a reflection of troubles at home, which, in combination, could invite an enemy invasion. Even then, a massive battle for the walls was unlikely. From the invader's perspective, why would one attack such a structure head-on when they could walk around it, exploit a weak point, or perhaps simply find collaborators to let them through? The various steppe peoples who preyed upon northern China, for instance, would routinely find ways to bypass the defenses in this way. Such risks were something the defenders understood, and it's why we spent so much time talking about their spheres of influence and proactive measures whose existence was the true defense of the frontier. The much more likely way that a mass invasion would occur can be seen with the Mongol invasion of Jin China. Here we see a long period of military buildup which is anticipated by both sides. As the Mongol threat looms, the Jin army is positioned to the north to repel their invasion. Knowing that the enemy will seek the path of least resistance, defenders are then spread out across the border, with troop concentrations waiting to the rear to reinforce vulnerable areas. Please note that at the time, the Ming sections of the Great Wall had not yet been built, and thus what existed was a patchwork set of ancient, new, and renovated fortifications which were more commonly referred to as the 9 garrisons. The emphasis here being that the troops, rather than the fortifications themselves, are what is important to the strategic defense of the north. Ultimately, the Mongol scouts identify where to strike, and the invaders launch multiple vectors of attack. Among the first areas targeted as their point of entry is the Wushabao fortress. A quick, decisive, bloody fight ensues, but ultimately the Mongols punch through. Thereafter, both sides faced off across the mountainous region of the west. But once more, the defender was forced to disperse its men across various valleys and passes, allowing the Mongols to mass forces against the most vulnerable among them and pierce the defensive line. Basically, a defeat in detail against a larger foe. This is the age-old defender's dilemma. They have the advantage of the fortifications, but the attacker has the advantage of dictating the place and time of battle. It's partially for this reason that the Romans seem to have preferred to have their legions march beyond the walls to sweep the enemy away in pitched battles rather than sitting back and appearing weak. Much of the time, actually, it was the Roman armies who used the walls as staging points and winter quarters for their own armies to launch invasions into enemy territory. Admittedly, though, this was because they were the ones who were the most professional forces of the age, and they had an advantage in such field fights. Against the steppe armies of the Mongols, the Jin way was likely more prudent. Thus we see that in either case, history rarely reflects the Hollywood climax of massive armies smashing together in an epic battle at the walls of civilization. Your best bet to find something similar would be at the walls which encircled cities facing siege, not those on the frontier. In conclusion, we can say that ancient border walls were indeed effective, just not in a vacuum and not in the ways we commonly imagine them. All of this had to do with spheres of influence, exchanges of commerce, diplomatic relations, and more. It was a multi-layered defense, and nothing was a silver bullet. Yet while this reality certainly doesn't make for the coolest Hollywood scene, it's definitely much more interesting to analyze and gives a lot more credit to the nuances of our ancient ancestors. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion of this topic today. If you want to hear a deeper discussion of the matter, I highly recommend you check out Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy's discussion on films which depict Great Walls. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.